นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Good afternoon, everybody. As you're aware, we've gathered for this event this weekend, commemorating 100 years of our teacher, Luang Por Chah. And just looking at the gathering today of Venerable Sangha members from all around the world, and yourselves here, it's a testament to Luang Por Chah's impact or what he's done, particularly for people who have faith and interest in the Buddhist teachings. As we know, his talks have been translated into many languages all around the world. And perhaps the most important thing is that his teachings and what you might call a system of training based on the Dhamma Vinaya or the monastic training has now spread out from Thailand, where he lived and practiced, around the world. Though I think KL doesn't have a monastery in the Ajahn Chah tradition, so maybe that's something you can consider. If anybody has the faith to think about joining together, offering some land, inviting monks to come, I think that would be a very good idea for all of you here. Because this is a gift that Ajahn Chah has given to the world. There are now monastic institutions, very small hermitages, very large monasteries all around the world that have been inspired by him and his students who have, the older generation, lived with him, trained with him, and now come out to start places. And from each of those monasteries, monks, nuns have trained, and people like yourselves get the chance to develop their life in harmony with the Sangha, and develop their faith and their practice with the Sangha. And I think this is one important, you might say, inheritance we've gained from Luang Por Chah, is seeing the role of Sangha, the importance of Sangha for preserving the Buddhist teachings and the ways of practice, not just for the Sangha, but for everyone. The first time I saw Luang Por Chah was on the TV when I was a teenager. So teenagers watching TV or video isn't all bad. By chance, I saw the program which you can still see on YouTube, The Mindful Way. And I still remember my reaction to seeing that program, understanding that there were monks living in the world, even though they lived in Thailand, and I lived in London, UK at that time, a long way away, but understanding that there were monks living in the world, not much different, in a way, not much different from the time of the Buddha, was a profound thing for me, because I'd already had some interest in Buddhism, but like many people, I assumed that perhaps it was something that was just now a kind of dead philosophy, or the teachings of the Buddha were just so old and the tradition so old, there was not much left. I didn't see it as a living tradition that was relevant to me as a human being living in this day and age. So that program was a great moment for me. I was very fortunate to have seen it, and it started my spiritual journey, which ended up later on as a young man traveling to Thailand and traveling to northeast Thailand, to Ubon. Unfortunately, the year I arrived in Thailand was the year Luang Por Chah stopped speaking. So I don't have any personal recollections of his words or teachings in that sense to share with you today. Obviously, many of the senior monks do, and there are many books available with his words of wisdom. But nevertheless, I did manage to live as a monk and practice while he was alive for about 8 years. And Luang Por Chah is more, to me, is more than just the person. You see Luang Por Chah in the Sangha, so you see many monks today from different nationalities, backgrounds, characters, or as they say, all shapes and sizes. And similarly, students, men and women all over the world. You can see something of Luang Por Chah in all of those who have faith in his way of practice and way of training. There's something left. That's what drew me in. When I first came to Wat Nanachat, the international monastery that Luang Por Sumedho had begun a few years before I arrived, I walked into the monastery with a friend at about 7 o'clock in the evening, and it was pitch black, and in those days there was no electricity, very basic facilities. So we walked in, we had one torch between two of us, and after about 20 meters, the batteries of that torch ran out. So we walked into the forest completely in the dark about Buddhist monasticism, and in the dark, literally. And we bumped our way through the forest, tripping over trees and branches until eventually we found a small light and went to the kuti of Ajahn Pasano, who gave a talk earlier this morning. And we were impressed the way he, as the senior monk, what we call an abbot, was so kind and humble, even though we were just a couple of travelers coming in without prior appointment in the early evening. He was kind enough to look after us. He talked to us and took us over to a place where we could stay, got us some bedding, a mat and a pillow. So we were very impressed with that, and we thought this monk must have a very good teacher. That teacher was Luang Por Chah. Luang Por Chah himself often talked about the way we can help others. Often we don't have to say a single word to help another person. We can help them just through being kind, doing a good thing at the right time, being a good example. And many of the teachers you see gathered here today embody that kind of thing. You can see a monk walk. Say this morning we walked on Bindabata. You see Luang Por Chah in the way the monks walk. They walk mindfully, peacefully, in a restrained manner. And for many people, when they see that, it brings up faith. There's a sense of these people are trained, these people are doing something. So these are just a few examples of how Luang Por Chah still lives on in the world today, in the monasteries, in the Sangha members, and then students, and even in the laity like yourselves. After I ordained became a monk, one of the things that I did and spent a lot of my time doing my first 5 or 6 years as a monk was to help assist looking after Luang Por Chah because he had become seriously ill. He wasn't completely paralyzed or in a coma, but he was invited to stop talking because he was losing his memory and speech was difficult. But one thing all the monks were very clear on was that Luang Por Chah was still very much alert, awake, aware, and there was still a great presence to him. One of the things about his monastery, if you have the chance to go there, even today, is still true. When you walk into his monastery, there's a great sense of peace, which we can say comes from Luang Por Chah himself and the Sangha who practice there and have practiced there over many, many years. You walk in from the road, outside there's traffic, there's people, buildings and so on, but when you walk into the monastery it's trees. So it's very cool and peaceful, and that's a tangible feeling of peace that I think many people feel. Last year there was a group of Europeans came to join in the memorial retreat, which they have every January to remember Ajahn Chah through the practice. People come together and camp in the monastery, keep the precepts, meditate, listen to talks. And this group of Europeans came, it was about 50 people from different European countries, and they walked in, and on that day they just happened to meet me and talk to me. And on that day in the monastery there was about 4,000 or 5,000 people camping and living in the monastery, practicing together. It was early afternoon, there was a Dhamma talk going on, much like this, and thousands of people were sitting very quietly in the monastery grounds, just listening to the Dhamma teaching. And the group from Europe were astounded. They asked how many people are present, and I said, well, including Sangha and visitors just camping in the monastery, there's about 5,000 or 6,000 people, and there's also many, many hundreds and even thousands of day visitors as well. And they couldn't understand how the place could be so peaceful, how everyone was very relaxed, there was nothing special going on, but there was just this clear sense of peace, and people were focused on the Dhamma. There was a Dhamma teaching going on. And that's something that I think most people can feel when they go to Ajahn Chah's monastery, even today, and even some of his other monasteries around the world. You go and there's a sense of peace, and this comes from all the many good qualities that come from the practice, from the training, or what you might call a system of training that he left us. So that was one thing that attracted me to live in the monastery. I went to spend many months of my life living at Wat Pah Pong with Ajahn Chah in his final years. And even though I wasn't able to communicate with him directly, speaking to him, I feel I learned a lot. Obviously I could learn from the other monks who could talk and speak to me, teach the Dhamma. But just being around Ajahn Chah, even as he was very sick, not very mobile, it was a good opportunity to learn many things, because it was a learning environment. When you're in a monastery, it's a place you come to learn about life, learn about yourself, and learn about how to get beyond suffering, end suffering, reduce suffering. So staying with Ajahn Chah, I felt very privileged and very fortunate to have the chance to assist, nursing, feeding him, looking after him. And because of this peaceful environment, and an environment that was set up so that you could learn about yourself, practicing the Dhamma, practicing mindfulness in daily life, you had the bhikkhu's rules, the rules of training, and all the good qualities that came out of the heart of Ajahn Chah and then the people around him. A sense of kindness, compassion, great sense of harmony, even though there were many people living there. It was a very harmonious place. I found it very helpful for my practice. Before Ajahn Chah became ill, he gave a kind of prediction that he would fall ill, and his body would decline and degenerate, as happens in old age. And he compared himself to a block of ice that you put out into the sun that gradually melts and melts until it's gone. So he predicted his own predicament, what would happen to him. And over about a period of about 10 years, his body did gradually decline. When I first started to assist him, there would always be a team of monks, sometimes during the daytime, 4 monks, and then another group overnight, another 4 monks. There'd always be at least 2 monks with him at all times, 24 hours a day. And the local hospital would send a nurse to be with him overnight. And I remember talking to the nurse on many occasions, and the nurse always said, you know, I really don't need to be here because the monks do such a good job. They have such faith, such devotion to Luang Por Chah, and they're keen to learn. They just learned everything that they needed to learn about how to look after an aging samana. Nevertheless, we appreciated the presence of the nurse because they could always impart knowledge, fresh knowledge, and that we didn't have. Then every morning there would be one doctor, a local GP, who would come and visit Luang Por Chah, check his pulse, his heart, and his blood pressure. And many times, because he was getting old, people said, oh, you don't need to do this. But he said, I want to come. That's what Luang Por Chah brought out in people, just this sense of devotion and wanting to be around him, wanting to help, wanting to practice. When I began looking after him, he could still move a bit, he could still swallow food, he could still exercise, lift his arms. He couldn't use his legs very much. He's very reliant on monks to lift him in and out of bed, put him in a wheelchair. But his arms, he still had some movement. So every day we would try and help him exercise to keep whatever muscles were left to help them to keep them as healthy as possible. So sometimes he would just remind you that he was still there, because not speaking, it would be easy for people just to forget him and think, well, it's just a kind of a body sitting there or lying there. But when you exercised him, he would remind you that he was there. He'd pull his arm. Maybe you pull his arm one way, he'd pull it back another way, just to kind of wake you up. And this seems to be the flavor of Ajahn Chah. Obviously, when he was alive and teaching, when he was healthy, he'd always be waking people up, teaching them something, pointing out something, getting them to see their own minds, wake up out of their daydreams, their thoughts or their moods. But even in illness, he still seemed to be able to do that in small ways. He could pull his arm, or when feeding him, like anyone, there were those days when he didn't want to eat or didn't want to eat very much. The nuns would lovingly prepare food for him every day. They'd make liquid food and try and make it as tasty as they could, but it was liquid food, so it probably wasn't very delicious. So no doubt, for whatever reason, there were some days he didn't want to eat very much. So he would make that clear, because the way we fed him in the early days, we'd have a large syringe full of the liquid food and gently put it into his mouth. He would have a rubber nozzle, and we'd help massage his neck and the throat so that to help him to swallow, because he'd literally have to make an effort to swallow every mouthful. So when he got fed up with that, then he would just stop swallowing. He wouldn't want to eat anymore. So most monks understood that and stopped, but occasionally a monk felt it was his duty to continue feeding. Maybe he had the idea that all the food had to be finished. So sometimes Luang Por Chah would just gently push the monk away with his hand to say, oh, enough, enough, which was usually the sign the monk got that. But occasionally a monk didn't get the message. So I remember one occasion, this monk, out of sense of duty, determined to feed Ajahn Chah, just kept bringing the syringe up to his mouth, trying to get him to say, just take a little bit more, Luang Por, a little bit more. So the hand came up, but he still had enough strength to completely knock the syringe out of the monk's hand. It went flying across the room and splattered all over the floor. And that monk said, "I nearly had a heart attack when he did that." You've heard something about how people had a sense of great respect and fear for Luang Por Chah. It's based on love, based on respect. But when he did things like that, then that monk became the one who was paralyzed, not Luang Por Chah. That monk felt, "I can't do it again," which is actually how I learned many of the techniques I had to learn to help Luang Por Chah. Was when other monks gave up because they just became so afraid of him, they would stop and they'd say, "You do it." Another technique of his that seemed to resonate with many of the monks, a way to just get people's attention in the sense of remind them what they're doing, wake them up. He could still cough even though he wouldn't speak. So many monks felt that he used his cough as a way to introduce mindfulness into the environment as we were looking after him. So if two monks were talking a lot, lost in conversation, forgetting Ajahn Chah, maybe forgetting their duty, there might be this little cough in the background, which should normally be enough for the monks to, "Oh yes, Luang Por is still here." But occasionally they were so engaged in their conversation they wouldn't get it. So then the cough had to be a louder cough. And that was a genuinely frightening scenario, because sometimes his coughing fits became very violent and he would literally shake and move so much there was a chance he could fall out of bed or out of his wheelchair. And sometimes it was just natural because of his own body, the accumulation of phlegm. But sometimes we got the impression he was doing it for a specific reason, and so there were quite a few occasions when two monks maybe were just talking too much or even having a difference of opinion, and Luang Por would just make the most violent kind of cough just to silence everybody, and they would have to run to assist Luang Por. Another personal experience I had when looking after Luang Por was I like to do it through the night time because it was very quiet, cool, peaceful in his kuti where he lived. There were no visitors, obviously, at night, so I could spend some time doing some meditation, sitting next to him, or even walking meditation nearby him. And I always found that very helpful for my own practice, just to increase my effort, my energy in the practice. But on a few occasions, you'd be sitting maybe 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. right next to him, because, as I said, we would never leave him alone, even through the middle of the night. And you're sitting, so naturally you get drowsy from time to time. There'll be a period where you're becoming drowsy and just start to nod, and then there'll be... Maybe it was just coincidence, but at 2 a.m. and he's been silent for many hours and then just goes... I always got the impression he somehow knew that when you were nodding. So many of the monks believed he could read your mind, know your mind, even though he couldn't speak in the last few years of his life. He still seemed to be very, very lucid and aware. You can only imagine what was going on in his mind, but these sort of small moments seem to give the impression he was very switched on to the people around him, and quite often more switched on than they were. I mean, he was surrounded by much younger people, monks, medical professionals and so on, who were fit, healthy, but often not very mindful. He was the one who seemed to be the most mindful, even though he was often under great pressure. His, physically his body was degenerating very badly. He probably had a lot of pain that he just endured. Why would he do that? We can only speculate again, but my reasoning would be just out of compassion. As when he was healthy and teaching people, helping people, he would give all his time to other people, especially the last few years of his life, and that possibly contributed to the decline of his health. But once he was ill and he stopped formally teaching, he still seemed to use whatever strength of mind and endurance and wisdom he had to keep himself going, because he was a great leader and figurehead for so many people. By the last few years of his life, he already had hundreds and hundreds of monks under his guidance, many monasteries and students all around the world. So many people believe he did put effort into just keeping his body going in whatever way he could, as long as he could, purely out of compassion for other beings. And even in that state, he could pass on some Dhamma. Every day he would be teaching people to see what happens to a human body. We don't see old people very much. And once people become immobile, sick, they're often in homes or hospitals, and only maybe their immediate relatives will visit. And often people don't want to visit the elderly and the sick. It's only once in a while. But Luang Por Chah had visitors every day. Sometimes a few, but most days a lot of visitors. So there are people constantly coming into contact with Luang Por Chah in this state of aging, the last few years of his life, and just being with him, sitting peacefully, sometimes talking with the monks, sometimes chanting, sometimes meditating, but always just being aware of Luang Por Chah and watching him like this block of ice just melting away in front of you. Luang Por said the human body is just made up of the four main elements: earth, air, fire, and water. They come together for a period of time, and then they gradually break apart. And that's true for everyone. All of us sitting here, we're going to have to face that, the aging of the body and the ultimate death of our own body. So that was maybe one of his final teachings, just getting people to look at the process of aging, sickness, and then ultimately his death. But look at it and learn from it. Learn this is what life is about. Once you're born, you have to age. As you age, you get sick, then you must die. So people would come and they would sit with him, meditate with him, and many people found they had very good meditation when they were with him. Again, it's the effect of the awakened teacher, the awakened master. It just brings out the best in people. The atmosphere was peaceful. People had faith in their hearts, so they would sit, and many people said the best meditation they ever had was sitting next to Luang Por Chah, even when he didn't say a single word. They found there was just something special, we say a magnetic presence to him that brought out very good qualities, brought out the effort, so people would like to come and just sit quietly and be near him. Strangely enough, even animals from the forest would come over. I can remember one morning, this huge turtle came out of the forest. Normally it lived maybe in the ponds, but they also walk around the forest. And these turtles are quite large, the size of a dog or something. And it just slowly crawled up to the kuti, and Luang Por Chah's kuti, where he was staying, had glass windows all around so that visitors could see when the curtains were open. If Luang Por Chah wasn't outside, they could bow and look at him through the window. And this turtle did exactly that. It just came up and it sat outside the window for about 4 hours. Unfortunately, it was short, so it couldn't see Luang Por Chah because it wasn't high enough to look through the window. But it seemed to be doing exactly the same as all the human visitors. Just sat there quietly for 4 hours, facing Luang Por Chah. And then in the afternoon, just got up, walked away, and we never saw it again. So there was kind of unusual experiences where animals would come, people would come, of course, all the time, drawn to this kind of magnetic figure. But even though he's passed away now, 26 years ago, something seems to stay on, doesn't it? We have his teachings in the books, the audios, and we have the way of practice, the system of training, and you can still benefit from that. You go to any of the monasteries, you can stay there and join retreats. Teachers come to Malaysia, teachers go all over the world now, and there's a chance to practice what he was encouraging us to do, and maybe that's the best way to express our gratitude and appreciation to Luang Por Chah is through the practice. I remember when he did finally pass away, another great meditation master from Thailand, Luang Ta Mahabua, very quickly came to visit. As soon as he heard the news that Ajahn Chah died, he came to visit and stayed the night in the monastery, and I was assigned to help look after him. And at the end of the evening, after he had talked to the monks and everybody had gone away, he called me over and he said, "Oh, now your teacher is gone. How do you feel?" And I couldn't say anything because the whole day had been a very special day, a very unusual day. Luang Por Chah died, and we'd been looking after him. I'd personally been looking after him for about 8 years, and obviously the Sangha for longer than that. So it's a very unusual day. So I couldn't answer him when he said, "How do you feel?" I just said, "I don't know," speechless. He said, when your teacher dies, what people tend to do, they'll build a stupa, and then they put the relics, the bones of the master in the stupa, and then they hang around the stupa for the rest of their life, sweeping and polishing, a bit like hungry ghosts. He said, "Don't do that." He said, when your teacher dies, what you have to do is go off to the forest and practice twice as hard as before. That's what we have to do now. Our teacher, Ajahn Chah, has gone, but his teachings live on. His way of practice lives on. And it will continue to live on as long as we all practice. It will be there for ourselves and for future generations. But the way we preserve Buddhism is through the practice. And I think this is the best way to honor and remember Luang Por Chah is through the practice. One of those practices is like this weekend, coming together to listen to the Dhamma, meditate, to chant. But make it clear to yourself, make that determination that when you go home, you've celebrated, commemorated Luang Por Chah's 100 years this weekend. How can you practice more when you go home? Maybe determine this is the time you're going to really do more meditation in your life. Go on retreats, set up your personal schedule in your daily life to do more meditation, listening to the Dhamma, do more dana, supporting Sangha. Invite more Sangha to KL or wherever you live. Go to monasteries, stay in those monasteries or support those monasteries. This is the way Luang Por Chah encouraged us to practice, to really bring the Dhamma into our lives. It won't be good just for us, but it'll be good for our families, our friends, our relatives. Because a monastery is it's a place that thrives through the practice. When we support the Sangha and we take an interest in the practice of Sangha and supporting and then follow along for ourselves, we gain so much. We gain a good example, seeing people who live together with a high standard of morality, dedicated to practicing mindfulness, practicing compassion, generosity in daily life, service for the community. You get that example the more contact you have with Sangha and with monasteries. The Sangha are the ones who dedicate themselves, literally dedicate their lives to the practice. Sometimes I get this vision in my mind of Ajahn Chah. It's just my own imagination, but when I think of him as a very strong person walking along, and the rest of us, both monks and laity, he's just dragging us along behind him. We're like kind of on a piece of cloth or a net or something, and he's so strong, he's just dragging us along. This symbolizes, the role of Buddhist monasticism in preserving the teachings and helping the world. From the time of the Buddha through down to this day and age, we have been fortunate. There have been noble ones, arahants, and well-practiced monks and nuns, and they're kind of dragging us along, dragging the world along. Because the way the world is, it doesn't want to go with the Dhamma. The way part of our mind is, it doesn't want to practice the Dhamma. It wants to get lost in the world, into all our pleasures and conflicts and confusion of the world. So the role of the Sangha is like it drags us along, literally by the scruff of the neck, picks us up. So the more you can put effort into your practice, stay close to the Sangha, take heed of the Sangha, learn the lessons that the Sangha has to teach, I think this will only bring you more benefit, more happiness in your lives. Sometimes monasteries are community places, just like Buddhist centers, like Bandar, Utama Buddhist Center. So there can be issues that arise when you have large numbers of people coming together to practice, whether it's Sangha or laity. Sometimes that's off-putting to people. You come together, you have to learn how to harmonize with others, listen to others, communicate with others, accept others. So sometimes that's off-putting for people, but try and keep the big picture in mind. These Buddhist centers and monasteries, they're a place of practice, and whatever other people are doing, keep focusing on the practice. And set aside some of those concerns about learning to harmonize with other people. It's not really the biggest issue. The biggest issue is learning to harmonize with ourselves, learning to understand ourselves and our own hearts and minds. I myself, living with Luang Por Chah, when I did live with him at the monastery, there was usually about 70 monks there, and daily there would be hundreds of visitors, and so sometimes it could get you get tired of it, tired of the duties, the chores that are involved, dealing with people. That's natural, but we always had Luang Por Liam as a leader there. Luang Por Chah had encouraged Luang Por Liam to take on the monastery, and he did an excellent job, surrounded by hundreds of monks, hundreds of lay people who all had their own views and opinions about the right way of doing things, about the right way to practice, the right way to run the place, the right way to look after Ajahn Chah. And he was an excellent example of how to rise above that, how to endure through that, and how to just keep focusing on the practice that he had learned from his teacher. And he's another great example, and he's a living example. He gave you teachings this morning, he's still alive today. This is a good reflection, how to practice, to keep focusing on the practice. Well, look at Luang Por Liam. He just keeps practicing year after year. He keeps focusing on his duties, what's important here and now, this day. I once asked him, because in those days, his job would be very draining, exhausting, having to run the Sangha, build the monastery or maintain the monastery, and particularly look after Luang Por Chah, arrange that for the Sangha. And I said, Luang Por Liam, what do you need to get through your day? Like, you're just devoting all your time to other people, and you have to deal with all the feedback and the criticism and the views and opinions. He said, all I need is just 1 hour to myself every day. That's all I ask for. 1 hour in 24. And there were many, many days when that's all he had. He'd got maybe 1 hour rest. But sometimes Luang Por Chah would fall sick, quite seriously ill at midnight or 3 a.m. And the first thing you had to do was go and call on Luang Por Liam, say, please come. And he'd been up all day doing all kinds of jobs. Maybe he'd just lay down for an hour, and then he has to be up and come and help. So all he ever asked for was 1 hour a day, which is not much. So a very excellent example of how to repay or give something back to the teacher and give something back to the community. I wasn't quite up to that level. After a few years of looking after Ajahn Chah, which I did generally love, there was a period where I got a bit frustrated with it. Physically it was quite tiring, and then sometimes people would argue about the best way to do it and tell you what you should be doing. So occasionally I got a bit frustrated with that. So at one point I went off on what we call tudong. I went down to southern Thailand, completely away. It's about 1,000 kilometers away from Luang Por Chah. I thought I'll go away and just be quiet in a bit of forest where no one else lives. And I did have a good time meditating, but being a Western monk, maybe perhaps that was more of a novelty in Thailand. So going down to the southern Thailand, staying in a forest in a part of Thailand where they didn't have Western monks, seemed to attract quite a lot of attention. So I stayed there for a few months, and from the first few days when nobody would know who I was and nobody was interested, gradually the interest grew. And originally I'd thought, oh, this is a very good place to practice, very quiet, far away from the big monastery. I can really get my time to meditate. But then day by day, more people would come to visit where I was staying and wanted to talk and started to express their opinions that they wanted to build a monastery where I was staying. It was just a forest without a monastery at that time. That they were saying, we should build a monastery and you should stay here and build us a monastery. And after 3 months of staying on retreat, I was experiencing, some days we had 100 people, 200 people come to visit. Everyone was expressing views and opinions, and I thought, this is starting to get a little bit like Ajahn Chah's monastery. I've come 1,000 kilometers and nothing has changed. And then when I had that thought, that day, when I took a rest, I had a strange dream, and in the dream I was staying on an island out in the ocean somewhere, very pleasant, very peaceful. And then this huge cruise liner turned up with thousands of passengers, and they all started flooding off the cruise liner and surrounded me as I was meditating on this little island. And I was thinking, oh no, this is no longer a very suitable place to practice. And at that moment, Luang Por Chah walked up and he said, it's foolish to think that you can get away from the world. Wherever you go, the world will always be there. The way to get away from the world is go inwards. Meaning into your meditation to develop calm and insight. So having had that dream, I thought maybe time to go back to find Ajahn Chah again. So I went back. Practice is like that. Sometimes you get to the point where you're very exhausted, or you're fed up, or you think you need a change, and maybe it is good. You go off and you get your change, but you realize in the end you can't change that much in the world, can you? You've still got your body, your mind. The world is still the world. The only way you can really change is to develop right view, right understanding, which is what Ajahn Chah was encouraging us to do. You should just get to see the way the world is. It's impermanent. It's not self. It's beyond your control. You can't control other people. You can't control your body. You can't stop your body aging. It gets sick. It doesn't do what you want. You can't stop the people you love from aging, getting sick, and eventually they will die and you have to separate from them. You can't control other people very much, what their views, their opinions, what they'll say, what they do. But what you can do is develop right view, right understanding. And that comes through training, this system of training, learning to reflect and contemplate your experience. And this is maybe one message that I've taken away from Luang Por Chah's teaching is, everything is something that you can contemplate to understand the Dhamma. The Dhamma is in everything, but you have to bring your mind to see that. So the training, the practice is about developing the tools, the means to do that well, to develop the ability to reflect, contemplate your experience, to develop the mindfulness that holds your attention, develop the compassion, the kindness for yourself, for others, that gives you a sense of well-being, that helps you to reflect clearly and see the truth. These are the kind of qualities that Ajahn Chah was encouraging, and all the teachers who've come from Ajahn Chah will be encouraging for you to practice. So maybe I'll leave the talk here today and just encourage you all to continue your practice. Keep listening to the Dhamma, practicing mindfulness, keeping the precepts, and particularly stay close to the Sangha. You know, the Buddha said the Sangha is a ratana, it's a treasure, it's your wealth, one of your main wealths in life. So stay close to it, value it. When you get the chance, meet with teachers, monks, listen to what they have to say, follow their example, and I guarantee this will bring you good things in your life. It will bring you happiness, it will bring you success. So I wish that for all of you, and I'll just say this much today.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.